August 17, 1945, Manila, Philippines. Captain James Morrison of the U.S. Army Medical Corps stood frozen outside what the Japanese had called a comfort station. Inside, 23 women cowered against the far wall, many unable to stand. Morrison approached the nearest woman slowly, medical bag in hand. She flinched violently, tried to crawl backward despite obvious injuries. He stopped immediately, raised both hands, and did something that would make several of the women weep uncontrollably. He asked permission. "I'm a doctor," he said through his Korean interpreter, Sergeant David Kim. "May I examine you? May I help you?" The woman stared at him, her expression suggesting she had just heard a concept so foreign after 3 years in Japanese captivity that her mind couldn't process it. A man was asking permission to touch her body. When Kim repeated the question, she began to cry. Then she began to scream, not in fear, but in grief so profound it had no other outlet. Within seconds, other women were crying too, some laughing through their tears, some staring in shocked disbelief. 23 women were weeping because for the first time in years, someone had treated them as human beings with the right to control their own bodies. Morrison looked at Kim, confused. The sergeant's face had gone pale. "Sir," Kim said quietly, "they're crying because you asked. Nobody has asked them anything for a very long time. What Captain Morrison discovered in that Manila comfort station would be replicated across the Pacific as American forces liberated Japanese-occupied territories. They would find thousands of women, mostly Korean, trapped in a system of sexual slavery so systematic that even hardened combat veterans struggled to comprehend it. And the simple act of asking permission before medical treatment, standard American military protocol, would shatter these women as thoroughly as liberation itself, because it represented everything the Japanese military had denied them: dignity, agency, the fundamental human right to say yes or no. The Japanese military called them ianfu, comfort women. Between 1932 and 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army enslaved an estimated 200,000 to 400,000 women in a system of sexual slavery that was organized, bureaucratic, and supported by military logistics. Roughly 80% were Korean, taken from Japan's brutally occupied colony. The system began taking shape in 1932. Japanese military planners conceived a solution to prevent random sexual violence by soldiers, organize it, control it, make it official military policy. This revealed the depths of their dehumanization. If soldiers were going to rape, the military would create infrastructure for it. In Korea, Japanese agents deceived young women with promises of factory work, nursing positions, or restaurant jobs. Women as young as 11 were told they could send money home to desperately poor families. The targeting was deliberate. Young women from poor families were particularly vulnerable to promises of economic opportunity. Others were simply seized, walking to market, working in fields, taken from their homes while families watched, powerless against the occupying army. The Japanese colonial government in Korea made resistance dangerous or impossible. Parents who protested faced threats or beatings. The Japanese military organized comfort stations with bureaucratic efficiency. Military orders specified their establishment in occupied territories. Supply requisitions listed condoms alongside ammunition and food. Medical inspection schedules tracked disease rates among the women. Transportation manifests recorded women like cargo, moved between stations as military needs dictated. Documents discovered after the war revealed this machinery in horrifying detail. A 1938 Ministry of War document detailed regulations for operating these facilities, locations, staffing, medical procedures. A 1939 directive specified each division should establish comfort stations with 20 women per 1,000 soldiers, a calculated ratio of sexual slavery to military manpower. Medical reports tracked infection rates between stations, as if optimizing a manufacturing process. Transportation orders showed women being shipped alongside military equipment. Financial records showed fees charged to soldiers, revenue that went to military administration, not the women themselves. Lieutenant Colonel Nagumo Shin later testified that comfort stations were standard everywhere the Japanese military operated. We received requisition forms for everything the military needed: ammunition, food, fuel, comfort women. The paperwork was identical. They were listed as military supplies, tracked through the same logistics systems we used for weapons. The stations themselves ranged from purpose-built facilities in major cities to crude shelters near front lines. In Shanghai, Seoul, and Manila, the Japanese established elaborate facilities. In combat zones, stations might be nothing more than damaged buildings or tents where women were held. Documents show the military assigned women to serve different ranks. Officers' stations featured slightly better conditions and fewer men per woman. Enlisted men's stations subjected women to far greater numbers: 30, 40, sometimes 50 men daily, especially on weekends or before units deployed to combat. Inside these stations, women experienced systematic rape the military called comfort provision. Each woman was assigned a small room, often just large enough for a mattress. Rules posted in stations specified time limits: 20 or 30 minutes per soldier. Lines of men would form outside these rooms, each waiting his turn. Women faced 30, 40, sometimes 50 men daily, especially before units deployed. The military issued tickets to soldiers, tracked usage, charged fees. Those who resisted were beaten. Escapees faced torture as examples to others. Pregnancy brought forced abortion, often in brutal conditions without proper medical care. Disease was common. The Japanese military conducted regular medical inspections, but these served to protect soldiers from infection, not to treat the women's illnesses. Some stations administered drugs to make women more compliant. Death from disease, botched abortions, or complications from abuse went largely unrecorded. The psychological destruction was systematic and deliberate. Women were forced to take Japanese names, erasing their identities. Many were forbidden to speak native languages. They were told their families had disowned them, that they were worthless, that this degradation was all they deserved. The military weaponized shame itself as a restraint. Even if these women escaped, where would they go in societies that would reject them? Japanese soldiers and officers who participated did so within a framework that normalized the abuse. Military indoctrination taught them that conquered peoples existed to serve Japanese interests. Korea, occupied for decades, was treated as a resource to be exploited. Korean women were no different from Korean rice or Korean labor, things to be used for Japanese benefit. When American forces began liberating Japanese territories in 1944 and 1945, they encountered a humanitarian catastrophe their training hadn't prepared them for. Combat-hardened soldiers who had witnessed the brutality of the Pacific War found themselves stunned by the systematic nature of the sexual slavery they discovered. Corporal Thomas Mitchell found the first major discovery in the Philippines in late 1944. We'd been told it was a military facility. Inside, we found 19 women locked in small rooms. Most were Filipino, some Korean. They'd been there for 3 years. When we opened the doors, they panicked, tried to hide. They thought we were more Japanese soldiers coming for them. Captain Morrison's experience in Manila replicated across the Pacific. In Okinawa, Burma, Indonesia, and China, Allied forces encountered Korean and local women in conditions that shocked experienced military doctors who thought they'd seen everything war could produce. Many suffered from advanced, untreated venereal diseases. Malnutrition was universal. Physical injuries from beatings, torture, and forced abortions were common. But the psychological trauma proved even more devastating. Women held for years had developed profound dissociation and total loss of agency. They couldn't make simple decisions. When asked what they wanted to eat, many couldn't answer. They'd been conditioned that their opinions didn't matter. Army Nurse Lieutenant Sarah Chen described the challenge. Filipino civilians we treated without issue, but comfort women flinched at every touch, couldn't make eye contact. When we asked about their medical history, they'd stare blankly. They'd learned their pain was irrelevant. The question, "Does this hurt?" became revolutionary. These women had experienced years where pain brought punishment, not relief. American medics asking about pain, adjusting treatment, treating them as partners in care. This shocked them as much as liberation. Sergeant Kim became essential to treating Korean women, but even with language barriers removed, communication proved difficult. I'd translate the doctor's questions perfectly. The women would look at me like I was speaking gibberish. "Do you want me to examine you now or wait until tomorrow? Which medication would you prefer?" Why was the doctor asking these things? Soldiers never asked. They just took what they wanted. The concept of consent, of having a choice about what happened to their own bodies, had become completely incomprehensible to them after years of having no choice about anything. Morrison's reports noted women having complete emotional breakdowns when asked for consent. One woman, maybe 22 years old, started laughing hysterically when I asked if I could examine her injuries. She laughed until she vomited. Then she started crying uncontrollably. Through the interpreter, she kept repeating, "You're asking me. You're asking me," over and over, as if this was the most absurd, impossible thing she'd ever heard. It took me a while to understand. For 3 years, nobody had asked her permission for anything. Her body hadn't been her own. Asking felt like a joke to her, something that couldn't possibly be real. American military regulations required explaining medical procedures and obtaining consent before treatment, except in life-threatening emergencies. This wasn't altruism or special kindness. It was standard medical practice, rooted in American cultural respect for individual rights and military medical ethics developed over decades of medical advancement. Army doctors and medics were trained that patients had rights, could refuse treatment, deserved to understand what was being done to them and why. But to women treated as objects for years, women who had been systematically stripped of every form of agency and control, this standard procedure represented a revolutionary recognition of their humanity. They were being treated as people who mattered, whose wishes had weight, whose bodies were their own. The contrast between Japanese and American military medical treatment revealed fundamentally different views of human dignity. Japanese military doctors examined comfort women regularly, but these examinations served exclusively to protect Japanese soldiers from disease, not to treat the women's health problems or address their suffering. Women were examined like livestock, checked for conditions that might affect the military's operational interests, then sent back to their rooms to continue being used. Their pain, their illnesses, their suffering mattered only if it interfered with their function as military supplies. The Japanese military medical system tracked disease rates among comfort women the way it tracked ammunition consumption, as a logistics concern. Medical reports compared infection rates between different stations, calculated optimal inspection frequencies, recommended replacing women whose health had deteriorated too much for continued use. The women themselves were never the concern. Only their utility to the military mattered. American military medicine operated on different principles. Every patient, regardless of nationality or legal status, was treated as a human being, deserving of medical care and fundamental dignity. This wasn't perfect. American military racism and segregation existed, as Staff Sergeant Robert Johnson could attest. But the baseline assumption in American military medicine was that patients had rights, could refuse treatment, deserved to have their pain addressed, and should be consulted about their own care. Staff Sergeant Robert Johnson, an African-American medic with the 93rd Infantry Division, found himself treating comfort women in the Philippines. The painful irony wasn't lost on him. I was segregated in my own army. Couldn't eat in the same mess halls as white soldiers back home. In Georgia, I couldn't even vote. But here I was in Manila, asking these Korean women permission to help them, explaining treatment options, treating them with more basic respect than I got in half of America. The Japanese had treated them as less than human for years. We treated them as patients who deserved care and dignity. That difference, that simple difference in how we approach them, meant everything to these women. As more comfort stations were liberated and more women were interviewed by American intelligence officers and medical personnel, American forces began to comprehend the true scale of the comfort women system. Intelligence officers compiled detailed reports from multiple liberation sites. Medical personnel meticulously documented the conditions they found, the evidence accumulated from across the Pacific Theater. This wasn't random abuse by undisciplined soldiers, but systematic sexual slavery organized by the Japanese military at the highest levels of command. The documentation was damning and comprehensive. Captured Japanese military directives showed that headquarters in Tokyo had sent detailed orders to field commanders outlining comfort station establishment procedures, staffing requirements, and operational guidelines. A 1939 directive specified that each army division should establish comfort stations with a calculated ratio, 20 women per 1,000 soldiers. This wasn't a suggestion, it was official military policy distributed through normal command channels. Transportation schedules documented the movement of women between stations as front lines shifted. Medical reports tracked disease rates among comfort women across occupied territories, comparing infection rates between different stations as if optimizing an industrial process. Pay stubs showed the fees soldiers were charged for access, revenue that went to military administration, never to the women themselves. The ages of the women shocked even experienced American personnel who thought they'd seen every atrocity war could produce. While some were in their 20s or early 30s, others had been taken as young as 11 or 12 years old. They'd spent their entire adolescence, years when they should have been in school, playing with friends, growing up in safety, in sexual slavery. Captain Morrison documented examining one woman who'd been taken from Korea at age 13 in 1938. She was now 20 years old. 7 years of her life, from childhood through adolescence, spent in comfort stations. She could barely remember her life before captivity, couldn't remember her Korean name, couldn't remember what normal life felt like. Kim Hak-sun would become the first comfort woman to publicly testify in 1991, breaking decades of silence. But in 1945, when Chinese forces liberated her from a comfort station in China, she was one of thousands telling similar stories to Allied forces, stories that matched each other in horrifying detail. They told me I would work in a factory making uniforms. They said my family would receive good money. Other girls from my village were going. When we arrived at the destination after days of travel, we found out the truth. This wasn't a factory. By then it was too late. We were prisoners, far from home, with no way to escape and no one to help us. When American forces encountered liberated comfort women and began understanding the system's full details, reactions ranged from shock to barely controlled rage. Even soldiers who had seen the most intense combat of the Pacific War, who had witnessed Japanese soldiers fight to the death rather than surrender, who had seen kamikaze attacks and bands charges, found themselves stunned and sickened by the systematic nature of the sexual slavery they discovered. This wasn't the chaos of battle. It was organized, documented, implemented as official policy. Private First Class James Wright, who participated in liberating a comfort station in the Philippines, wrote home to his parents in words that military censors let through because they captured what many soldiers were feeling. "I've seen men die in horrible ways in this war. I watched friends burn alive in tank fires. I've seen Japanese soldiers fight with insane courage, even in hopeless situations. But nothing prepared me for what we found in that building in Manila. The Japanese military did this on purpose, organized it like they organized ammunition supply, kept meticulous records of it. And the women, most of them aren't even Japanese, they're Korean. The Japanese took them from their own colonial subjects to use as slaves for their soldiers. I can't make sense of it. I thought I understood this war, but I don't understand this. American commanders at all levels struggled with how to handle the discovery and its aftermath. The comfort women needed immediate medical care and long-term support, housing, food, security, eventually transportation home. But American forces were military occupiers operating in a chaotic post-war environment, not a humanitarian organization equipped for large-scale civilian relief operations. The women's home countries were themselves in turmoil, Korea still under Japanese control until Japan's surrender, then immediately occupied and divided by the US and Soviet Union. China was descending into civil war. The Philippines was recovering from years of brutal occupation. Meanwhile, the medical treatment of liberated comfort women continued day by day, and with it continued the profound psychological impact of simple human dignity. Lieutenant Margaret O'Brien, working at a military hospital in Tokyo in late 1945, described the gradual recovery process she witnessed in some of the women. The physical healing was relatively straightforward, though slow. We could treat infections, address the malnutrition, set broken bones, remove shrapnel, standard military medicine. But the psychological healing was something entirely different, something we weren't really trained for. One woman I treated personally had been held for 4 years straight. For the first several weeks she was with us, she couldn't make eye contact with anyone. She'd just stare at the floor or wall. Then one day, I'll never forget it, when I asked if she was comfortable with her bed position, she looked directly at me, made eye contact. She nodded yes. She smiled, just a tiny smile. I realized in that moment that it might have been the first time in years, maybe since her capture, that anyone had asked about her comfort and actually waited for her answer and cared what she said. Repatriation itself posed enormous challenges that American military government struggled to address. Many comfort women faced the prospect of shame and rejection in their home communities if they returned. The stigma of sexual slavery, despite it being absolutely forced upon them against their will, made social reintegration difficult or impossible in conservative societies that placed enormous cultural value on female chastity and sexual purity. Some women made the painful choice not to return home at all, fearing rejection by their own families. Others did go home, but kept their experiences completely secret for decades, carrying the trauma entirely alone rather than face potential social ostracism or bring shame to their families. War crimes prosecution of the comfort women system faced multiple obstacles that would ultimately result in justice denied. First, many victims were unwilling or unable to testify publicly. The shame and trauma of discussing rape in public in conservative societies where female sexual purity was culturally paramount made speaking out nearly impossible for most survivors. Without direct victim testimony, building strong legal cases proved extremely difficult. Second, the nature of the crime didn't fit neatly into existing war crimes categories that had been established at previous tribunals. Sexual slavery wasn't specifically addressed in international law as it stood in 1945. Prosecuting it as a systematic war crime would require establishing entirely new legal precedents that the tribunal was hesitant to pursue. Third, American occupation authorities faced mounting pressure to rebuild Japan quickly as a Cold War ally against Soviet expansion. Prosecuting too many Japanese officials risked destabilizing the new government that Washington wanted to establish as a democratic bulwark in Asia. The result was selective prosecution. Some cases were pursued. Dutch comfort women's cases resulted in some convictions, as these involved white European women, and their governments demanded justice loudly. But the broader systematic enslavement of Asian women, particularly Korean women, received far less attention and virtually no prosecutions. The comfort women system, despite being meticulously documented and involving hundreds of thousands of victims, largely escaped comprehensive justice at the Tokyo Tribunal. This failure of justice compounded the original suffering. Not only had these women been enslaved, raped, tortured, and treated as objects, but most of their abusers escaped any punishment whatsoever. Many of the Japanese officers who had established and administered comfort stations went on to successful careers in post-war Japan. The women scattered across Asia, carrying their trauma in silence. The documentation American forces created, detailed medical reports, extensive intelligence assessments, photographs of stations and survivors, recorded interviews, was methodically filed away in military archives. For decades it gathered dust, known to a handful of specialists, but absent from public consciousness and mainstream historical narratives. The suffering of these women became a historical footnote, overshadowed by other aspects of the war that were deemed more important or more appropriate for public discussion. But the simple act of asking permission, of treating these women as human beings with agency rather than objects to be used, had planted seeds that would eventually grow into a global movement for justice, even if it took nearly half a century. In 1991, Kim Hak-sun broke 46 years of silence and publicly testified about her experience as a comfort woman at a press conference in Seoul. Her courage, coming forward despite the social stigma she knew she would face, inspired others who had carried the same secret shame for decades. Soon, dozens and then hundreds of former comfort women across Asia began speaking out, organizing, demanding acknowledgement from the Japanese government. They challenged the historical denial and minimization that had buried their suffering for nearly 5 decades. These elderly women demonstrated remarkable courage. In societies that stigmatized victims, they testified publicly. They traveled to international forums. They protested at Japanese embassies. The evidence included their testimony, but also documentation American forces created in 1945. Morrison's medical reports, discovered in the National Archives in the 1990s, provided powerful corroboration. His notes about women crying when asked permission captured the profound impact of simple human dignity. The documentation revealed the contrast between Japanese and American military culture. The Japanese created sexual slavery. The Americans recognized it as humanitarian crisis and responded with medical care and dignity. As pressure mounted in the 1990s, Japan's response evolved slowly. In 1993, Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono acknowledged that comfort stations operated under military control and recruitment involved coercion. But this fell short of full acknowledgement and compensation survivors demanded. The handful of survivors in their 90s continue demanding justice. They protest weekly in Seoul, refusing to let the world forget. Soon there will be no living survivors, but their testimony stands alongside American documentation from 1945. Morrison's 1945 report captured the essential truth. I have never encountered trauma as profound as what these comfort women experienced. The systematic nature of their abuse, the complete denial of their humanity, created injuries medicine alone cannot heal. What struck me most was their response when I asked permission. They wept, they laughed, they stared in disbelief. I had asked them a question no one had asked in years. What do you want? May I help you? The simple recognition that they had a right to control their own bodies shocked them as much as liberation itself. Sergeant Kim later reflected, "When I saw those women cry because a doctor asked permission, I understood something terrible had happened. Not just physical abuse, the mental destruction of treating them as non-human. Every day we treated comfort women, I saw the same shock that we asked, that we cared, that we treated them as people with rights." The comfort women who survived and eventually told their stories demonstrated extraordinary courage. They confronted societies that wanted them silent, governments that denied their suffering, and historical forces that tried to erase their experience. Their fight transformed international human rights law, recognition of sexual violence in war as a war crime, international tribunals to prosecute these crimes, inclusion of sexual slavery in the Rome Statute, all owe a debt to comfort women survivors who refused to be forgotten. The story of American medics asking permission before treating comfort women represents a moment when fundamental human dignity was restored to people systematically stripped of it. Even in war, simple respect for human agency can be revolutionary. The women wept because the question itself was radical. It assumed they were people who could say yes or no. It recognized them as individuals with the right to control their own bodies. After years of systematic dehumanization, that recognition released grief, rage, relief, and hope all at once. Those tears testified to what the Japanese military had done and to what simple human decency could restore. The recognition that every person has inherent worth, that consent matters, that asking permission is respect for fundamental human rights. The documentation created by American personnel preserved this testimony. Medical reports, intelligence assessments, photographs, interviews, evidence that would later support survivor testimony and their fight for justice. The comfort women who still survive and the memory of those who have died deserve recognition not just as victims, but as resistors. They survived systematic dehumanization. They endured unimaginable abuse. They carried traumatic secrets for decades, and eventually many found courage to speak out, to demand justice, to insist their suffering be acknowledged. Their courage was matched by those who documented their suffering. American personnel who treated them with dignity, recorded what they found, and created evidence that would support justice. Morrison asking permission, Chen adjusting treatment based on patient comfort, Kim translating not just words but humanity. They didn't just provide medical care, they provided witness to a crime and dignity to its victims. The comfort women's tears were grief for what they'd lost, rage at what had been done, and recognition they were finally being treated as human beings. Those tears testified more powerfully than any document to the crime they'd survived and the dignity they deserved. The lesson resonates beyond this specific case. It teaches that human dignity matters, that consent is not a minor technicality, but a fundamental right, that how we treat the most vulnerable reveals who we are. The American medics who asked permission weren't being extraordinary, they were following standard protocol. But to women systematically denied agency, that standard became extraordinary. The comfort women who wept when asked permission were not weak. They were human beings who had endured systematic dehumanization and were finally being treated as people again. Their tears were strength, the strength to feel again, to hope again, to recognize that they deserved dignity and respect. Their story reminds us that in the face of systematic evil, simple human decency becomes revolutionary, that asking permission matters, that treating people with dignity matters, that recognition of fundamental human rights matters. When we fail to provide these things, we participate in dehumanization, but when we do provide them, even in small moments, even with simple questions, we can begin to restore what cruelty has destroyed. The Korean comfort women who wept when American medics asked permission before treatment were crying for all they had lost and all they might regain. Their tears testified to crimes that must never be forgotten and dignity that must never be denied. And their courage in eventually speaking out demonstrated that the human spirit, though it can be brutally abused, cannot be permanently destroyed. 79 years after Captain Morrison asked that first question in Manila, after he raised his hands and said, "May I help you?" and watched women break down crying at the radical concept of consent, we understand more fully what that moment represented. It wasn't just one doctor's compassion, it was the collision between two fundamentally different views of humanity itself. The Japanese military system had been built on the premise that some people were objects, that Korean women existed to serve Japanese military needs, that their suffering was irrelevant, that their agency could be eliminated entirely. Every aspect of the comfort women system reinforced this dehumanization through deliberate policy and systematic practice. The American military medical system despite its own flaws and the racism that existed in American society, operated on the premise that every patient was a human being deserving of care and respect. The requirement to ask permission wasn't special kindness. It was routine practice based on fundamental principles about human rights and dignity. When these two systems collided in Manila in August 1945, the women's tears revealed which premise was true: their shock at being asked permission, their weeping at being treated as people, their inability to comprehend that someone cared about their consent. All of this testified to what they had endured and what simple decency could begin to restore. Today, the few surviving comfort women are in their 90s. Soon there will be none left to bear direct witness, but their testimony lives on in their own words, in the documentation American personnel created, in the historical record that cannot be erased, and their legacy lives on in international law that now recognizes sexual violence in war as a crime against humanity. Captain Morrison died in 1978, having practiced medicine for decades after the war. He never spoke publicly about the comfort women he treated. His family donated his papers to a medical archive, including those reports from Manila. When researchers discovered them in the 1990s, his words provided crucial corroboration for survivors finally finding their voice. Sergeant Kim lived until 2003, long enough to see the comfort women finally receive international recognition. In his last interview, he returned to that moment in Manila. "Those women taught me something I've never forgotten. Human dignity isn't automatic. It can be systematically destroyed, but it can also be restored, sometimes through the smallest acts. A question, a choice, simple respect. I saw women cry because someone asked permission. That taught me more about human rights than any book or lecture ever could." The story of comfort women and the American medics who asked permission before treating them carries urgent relevance today. It reminds us that dehumanization is never accidental. It's always systematic, always deliberate, always rationalized by those who benefit from it. It teaches us that respect for human agency and dignity must be actively practiced, not just abstractly proclaimed. And it demonstrates that even in history's darkest chapters, simple human decency can be revolutionary. May their testimony never be forgotten. May their suffering be acknowledged. May their dignity be honored. And may we learn from their story that simple respect for human agency and rights is not a small thing, but the foundation of human civilization itself.